I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. We're delighted you've decided to join us here today to hear from and ask questions of our assembled SRF experts and panelists. Today's session is based on several years of EPIC's research and analysis on SRFs, and of course, the deep experience of the state agency experts who join us here today. Next slide, please. We'll go over some introductions of who's here today, a little bit about how this fits into EPIC's broader work on water. And then Lauren and Danielle will lead us in a policy brief presentation. Then we'll have the panel discussion and Q&A, and then close off and have next steps. So the next slide, you'll see who is here from EPIC and what our broader work is organized around. Our broader water work is all part of an initiative to improve access to safe, reliable, and affordable water infrastructure. We believe that water infrastructure is really key to protecting human and environmental health and supporting thriving economies, local economies. Our other initiatives, in addition to our SRF initiative, include helping communities directly through the Funding Navigator, that's our technical assistance program, accelerating lead service line replacement, and then driving investment and scaling up investment in green infrastructure. And when you think about it, all three of these initiatives are impacted by and related in some way to drinking water and clean water SRFs. And if you joined us today, you likely understand, and it looks like based on the folks who have registered, you understand the vital role the SRFs play in financing drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure projects. They've helped provide assistance to communities all across the country to make their infrastructure more affordable. So today, we're going to explore policies for expanding access to these vital resources with the help of our presenters and panelists and input from you too. We really welcome questions and input in the chat. And at the end, we'll share some resources for applying these concepts in your states. So the next slide. That's where we show who is here from EPIC. So I am Denise Schmidt, the Director of Water at EPIC. Our experts here joining us today are Danielle Goshen, who's our Senior Policy Analyst at EPIC, and then Lauren Kwan, who's a Policy and Data Analyst at EPIC. We are joined by, I'm really grateful for the participation of Casey Sweeney, Environmental Loans Project Manager with the Wisconsin DNR, and then Mark Conradi, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Mark, Financial Specialist for Affordability and Rates with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, aka EAGLE, as we all affectionately refer to them as. The next slide. Thank you all for providing us with information when you registered. Last time, some folks on the last webinar were folks were interested in who has been involved. So here's who's registered for today. It's about 44% of folks that administer are directly involved with the SRFs, a couple applicants, some technical assistance providers, and then advocates who want to see these vital funds reach their communities are about 24% of our registrants. The next slide, please. Yes, so we want to hear and learn who's on the call with us here today and who's SRF curious as we are. Share your name, please, location and organization in the chat, and do engage with the Q&A. You can post your questions either in the Q&A or the chat box anytime. We'll be monitoring both. And do feel free to use the raise hand function in Zoom to ask a question or make a comment live. The next slide, please. And this is where I will turn it to Lauren to lead us off in the discussion.
Thanks, Denise. So today's webinar highlights a recent policy brief from EPIC that dives into how state disadvantaged community definitions, or DAC definitions for short, can help prioritize access to state revolving funds for under-resourced communities. This brief is a content-rich discussion of our findings from a 50-state analysis of states' DAC definitions, specifically from their federal fiscal year 2023 drinking water intended use plans. The brief goes into a variety of key policies relating to DAC definitions, such as the factors that states use, the methodologies for determining eligibility, and the geographic scope for which the definitions are applied. And last but not least, this brief of course includes some key considerations and recommendations for best practices that states can consider implementing in their definitions. Now, before getting into the policy decisions that states make around these disadvantaged community definitions, I'd like to highlight a few key concepts. So firstly, what is a disadvantaged community and why are we defining them? For the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, states are required to define and assist disadvantaged communities, or DACs, which are under-resourced communities or water systems that would otherwise face financial, managerial, and/or technical constraints if they received only loans from the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. Now, the Safe Drinking Water Act requires states to allocate between 12 and 35% of its annual base funding as additional subsidies to the state-defined DACs, and that's usually in the form of grants or principal forgiveness. And under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IJA for short, 49% of states' general supplemental grants must also be provided as principal forgiveness or grants to state-defined DACs. It is important to note that DAC eligibility doesn't necessarily guarantee favorable or any assistance from the state revolving funds, but they are important in identifying and prioritizing eligibility for additional subsidies and other benefits from the state revolving funds. So with that being said, going forward in this webinar, when we use the term DAC, we are referring specifically to DACs as defined by state SRF policies. Now, I just mentioned additional subsidies and principal forgiveness. When we discuss additional subsidies to DACs, we generally use the term principal forgiveness to refer to these because this is the most common type of additional subsidy that states will allocate. However, some states will also or instead provide grants to DACs. But principal forgiveness, what is it? It is structured like a loan and functions like a grant because it does not need to be repaid. It allows a portion of the loan to be waived and reduces the financial burden on recipients. And that's why principal forgiveness is so desirable to applicants to the state revolving funds. And so, as we'll be exploring in this webinar, states develop these criteria to determine in DAC definitions which projects or communities will qualify for this limited principal forgiveness. The next concepts, they relate to the types and number of DAC definitions that states can have. While states are required to have a DAC definition in their drinking water SRF programs, states can actually have more than one. They might choose to have more than one, for example, to highlight certain communities, which we'll be hearing about soon from Mark with its overburdened and significantly overburdened communities from Michigan. Or states can have different definitions for different programs under its drinking water SRF, such as for the allocation of lead service line replacement or emerging contaminant funds that come from the supplemental IJA appropriations. And many states do choose to have a separate DAC definition for their lead service line replacement programs, in fact. In our brief and in this webinar, though, please note that our findings relate to the DAC definitions under what we term the General Purpose Drinking Water SRF Program, and that refers to the base as well as the IJA General Supplemental Funding. So the brief does analyze the 50 states, but this actually includes a total of 63 general purpose DAC definitions for federal fiscal year 23. Lastly, I'll briefly explain what DAC factors are. These are the metrics used to determine DAC eligibility, and examples of these are median household income, water system size, poverty rates. Those are DAC factors. And our brief organizes them by socioeconomic, demographic, financial, public health, and other additional categories. For each factor that states add to their definitions, states can also set thresholds for these factors. And these thresholds are specific numeric or percentage cutoffs applied to each factor to determine if a community meets the DAC definition. For example, with median household income, a threshold would be if a project service area's median household income is 80% of the state's MHI, or if the median household income is X dollars in a given year. And while these thresholds are important elements of DAC definitions, they are not the main focus in our brief. So now that we've discussed these key terms and concepts, I'll be starting us off today with the first of three main policy decisions covered in the brief, which is the factors that states use to develop their DAC definitions. As a reminder, these findings relate to states' general purpose drinking water SRF programs, and not to any separate definitions under the lead or emerging contaminant programs. And so what did we find? The vast majority of states have a single DAC definition for their general purpose programs, though there are 8 states that have more than one DAC definition. Additionally, the number of DAC factors in these definitions varies. A few states use just one factor, but most states will use multiple factors. And Nevada, by far, we found has the most factors overall, a total of 23 in its definition. Next, median household income is by far the most frequently used factor in states' DAC definitions, and it is used by 34 states and in 45 definitions. This table can also be found in our brief. It demonstrates the different types of DAC factors and which ones are most and least common. Our brief also dives into the pros and cons of these factors if you're interested. And while median household income is the most frequent, water rates, unemployment rates, and poverty rates are also common. And some of the less common but still impactful factors relate to environmental justice and population trends. I'll now briefly go over some best practices and recommendations for selecting factors in DAC definitions. Though the previous findings relate to the general purpose DAC definitions, the following recommendations can be applied to definitions under states' lead and EC programs as well. So relating to clarity, transparency, and accessibility, we encourage states to make the DAC eligibility criteria simple and transparent, namely using readily available public data, providing clear methodologies, and offering tools to help applicants easily assess their eligibility. Next, there will be no one-size-fits-all definition. States can consider tailoring its DAC definitions to the characteristics of key disadvantaged groups, as well as different project types. When under-resourced communities have different needs for lead, emerging contaminants, or other infrastructure issues, we recommend states to create multiple tailored DAC definitions. And this approach helps ensure that financing and funding opportunities are directed to those most in need. And while median household income is a common factor, there are other DAC factors that can provide a fuller picture, and we recommend using either an alternative to median household income or, in addition to, a combination of socioeconomic, demographic, and financial factors. For example, community vulnerability factors, poverty rate, lowest quintile income, and water rate burdens are all great candidates. And lastly, states should periodically review and update their DAC definitions to reflect changing economic and demographic conditions. States can also engage with local community groups to help ensure that definitions and assistance align with community needs and priorities. And this iterative and collaborative approach fosters more comprehensive and sustainable solutions for under-resourced communities. So with that, I'll pass it off to Danielle to discuss the next 2 key policy decisions from our brief.
Thank you so much, Lauren. So the second policy decision that we discussed in our brief is the type of DAC definition used. As Lauren noted, many states have multiple DAC definitions, like Texas, that provides one definition for DACs and another for small systems, very small systems, or in the case of other states, significantly overburdened systems, in addition to other definitions for lead programs or EC programs. However, each definition that a state provides can generally fall into one of 2 different categories. And the first of this is an in-out definition. We just created these categories, but they all kind of fall into one of these 2 buckets. So this first one, I have an example on this slide. For this hypothetical approach, we see that DAC factors are binary. A community either meets each criteria or factor that's under the definition, or it does not. So in this case, we have MHI is less than 80% of the statewide AMHI, or a poverty rate is higher than 10%. So, for each of these 2 factors, the community either meets it or it does not, meaning that they either meet the DAC definition eligibility or they do not. Now, the second approach on this slide is called a scaled approach. For this category, a state assigns scaled points to applications across different factors used in their definition. This approach allows flexibility for different communities based on different types of disadvantaged characteristics. Some states even provide more principal forgiveness or prioritization points for communities that are more disadvantaged based on the scaled DAC definition. So here we see three different factors that are used: MHI, poverty rate, and unemployment rate. And you can see if a community is more disadvantaged in one of these factor categories, then they receive more points. And so this is really interesting because, if a community under this hypothetical situation needs to receive 30 points under this system in order to be eligible as a disadvantaged community, they can do that through multiple routes. We can see that they can get it just by the AMHI. If they have less than or equal to 60% of the statewide AMHI, then they could become a DAC. Or they can do it if they, reach a poverty and unemployment rate scoring criteria based under this scaled approach. So it allows multiple different pathways to get to the same result. And this recognizes, that communities face a bunch of different issues, and this allows for that flexibility within the definition. Okay, so what did we find across the states? When we look across the states, we see that a majority of states use the in and out approach, which is under the green bar on this chart on the right. However, 26% or 13 states use a scaled approach. Notably, some states use different approaches in different definitions, like North Carolina. And this is, this kind of would be expected in some ways. An in-out approach is administratively more simple. And a scaled approach is a little bit more administratively hard, and it's maybe a little bit more administratively, or maybe a little bit more difficult for the applicants themselves to understand if they would meet the DAC eligibility criteria as well. However, when we looked across the states, we really want to encourage states to adopt scaled definitions. These scaled definitions allow for that flexibility to capture, the complexity of communities and how they might be disadvantaged. Okay, so moving on to the third and last policy decision discussed in our brief, we're going to look at geographic scope. Geographic scope looks at the geographic area to which the factors within the DAC definition are applied to. And this can either be the project service area, the project applicant as a whole, or a combination of the two. So as a hypothetical scenario down at the bottom, I have the city of Chicago, which I'm currently in right now. And so if a state applies its DAC factors to a project applicant like the city of Chicago, that project might not be eligible for additional subsidization as a DAC if they have an AMHI requirement that they do not meet, because as you can see here, the city of Chicago as a whole has over 80,000 AMHI. However, if the project service area is considered, for example, South Side, where AMHI is much lower than the city as a whole, then the project might qualify as a DAC in this hypothetical situation if all of those factors are applied to those who are really benefiting from the project specifically. So when we look at states' DAC definitions, we see that the majority of states apply their DAC criteria to the project applicant as a whole. In that previous slide, that would mean the city of Chicago. Less than a third of the states use multiple geographic scopes, however, within a single DAC definition. And then a minority of states use the project service area as the geographic scope. So for our recommendation here, we encourage states to utilize a project service area as the geographic scope where there is enough information about that community that's benefiting from a certain project. It's important to note that when project service area is used as the geographic scope, then additional prioritization points should be considered for applicants where the community as a whole is more disadvantaged in order to ensure that limited principal forgiveness is provided to communities that need it most. So now that we've gone through the main 3 policy decisions that are discussed in our brief, I'd like to kick it over to Denise to start our panel discussion.
Absolutely. And before we go there, thank you both, Danielle and Lauren. Really appreciate it. And I realized that I was remiss for you all. I should tell you that if you were joining and expecting to see Janet Meisner-Pritchard on this call, you get the B team here and me moderating today, as Janet was not able to attend. She's not feeling well today. And so I missed introducing our panelists and presenters. So Danielle and Lauren, thank you both. Danielle is, as I mentioned, our senior policy analyst. She brings a legal lens to a lot of our analysis, given her background and experience in this space. And then Lauren also is focuses on water infrastructure funding and financing. Before we turn it over to the panelists, this might be a good bridge question because we have a question from the audience about, can you name a few states that have separate DAC definitions for LSLR, and why do they do this? And I believe maybe Mark and Casey might have something to add there as well.
Yeah, I can start, and then Mark and Casey, if you guys want to fill in any additional information, please feel free. But there are many different ways that states might want to provide different definitions. One example, as you asked, is Texas. Texas, as like a lot of other states, they have multiple IUPs for different programs. They have one IUP covering all the policies and projects that are submitted for the general activities program, meaning, the base funding and the general sub funding under IJA. And then another IUP for their lead program, which has different policies attached to it, and then another IUP for the EC program. So, communities facing lead issues are different than communities facing, other water issues. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes there's a complete overlap, sometimes there's not. There's also, like vulnerable communities for lead, for lead issues might look different than vulnerable communities for EC issues. When we're looking at lead funding, we really want to also understand, what the demographics of an area is. If there's a significant population under 5 years old, that's going to be really important for prioritizing limited lead funding. So a state might want to devise criteria that looks at those age demographics within different communities. So that's just one reason why. There's also different requirements under bill, or IJA, for principal forgiveness. So under the EC program, 100% of the funding goes out as principal forgiveness. Under the IJA LSLR program, that's 49% principal forgiveness. So, because there's a need to get more funding out as principal forgiveness, and it's a new program in general, the state might want to have a more relaxed definition for disadvantaged communities to encourage more applicants as they're starting a new program. So there's many different reasons why a state might want to have different criteria under different programs.
Yeah, I can jump in, Danielle. Thanks for that overview. I think a lot of that is really great. In Wisconsin, one of the, I think one of the main differences for the LSL program in comparison to the base general DWSRF program is that the general DWSRF sees a wide range of different project types coming into it that we need to consider. So the specific focus of the LSL program, I think, allows us to be more specific with a lot of those criteria and factors, as you mentioned, like that under 5 metric is something that is specific to lead or is valuable for lead, but maybe less valuable for the larger base DWSRF. Also, the unique nature of lead service line projects in a similar vein, we're able to say that the project benefits can be tied more closely to the geographic area and the replacements. And that might not be always the case with our base DWSRF program, right? Like if there's a new well going in, or it's harder to tie those project benefits to a specific geographic area, and therefore metrics that will go along with that.
I'll just pop in and say in Michigan, our definitions are the same, but we have some play at the end with our IUP. Is I think this year, I think they're doing a separate IUP for lead service specifically. But the way our legislation works is 20%, and we allocated 25% of our scoring for any IUP is specifically DAC related. So that's the portion I work on, and then the other 75 points are based on the individual projects and everything that get added. So ultimately, our DAC definition allows disadvantaged communities to initially get 25 points that no one else could get just for even ranking on the list. And then beyond that, principal forgiveness and other things are determined year by year based on which pots of money are available and how we can easier get it out to certain groups. So we have a bunch of small communities one year, a bunch of big communities next. We can kind of tweak how we do our principal forgiveness. And that's unfortunately not my skill set. So I don't have as much info on that, but that's how we handle it.
Thank you both. And so they've sort of introduced themselves as the experts in their states, but I'll just give you a little overview of Casey and Mark before we turn to their slides. Casey started out in the water and sanitation field with an international volunteer program, and that allowed him to support small-scale projects in Mexico. He joined the Wisconsin DNR in 2019 and serves as the Clean Water Fund Program Federal Liaison Policy Analyst for that environmental loan section. And that's where he focuses on planning, document development, and data reporting. Mark has a BS in environmental economics and policy from Michigan State University. Go Sparty. He is an affordability and rate specialist for Michigan State revolving loan programs in the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. He has 19 years of experience working with communities throughout the state on implementation strategies for rates, affordability, and asset management plans. So with that, I will turn it to Casey and I think Valerie, somebody's going to share his slides.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Denise. And thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure being here. I really wish that this policy brief from EPIC was around when we first revisited our DAC definition, because a lot of these policy factors we stumbled onto over time. There were certainly considerations that now looking back we made, but I don't think we were intentionally thinking about a lot of these things when we first started. So in some ways, this is a great setup. A lot of what I'll talk about is things we've talked about, but more specifically, kind of the questions that we were asking ourselves as we revisited our DAC definition. Just a little bit of background. We looked at our DAC definition in depth with a small team over about a 3-month period of really looking into it with many meetings and a lot of time outside of those meetings, analyzing the data and trying to understand what would be a good solution. Ultimately we came to realize that, and I think, this is being talked about, and revisiting these DAC definitions, I think is important. After all that work, we realized that, we would ultimately have maybe some progress on revisiting the DAC definition, improving it, but you're certainly not going to perfect it, which is a challenge for a person like myself who wants to really find the best setup. But with that, I'll just kind of talk about some of these factors that we looked at. As mentioned previously, I think the first focus, or one of the more underlying things, was the scale we wanted to evaluate at. Would we be looking at data at the community level or something more granular? And would this data, the data that we ultimately use, would that be supported by something more granular? And if so, would it align with the project area? Our awards are made at the municipal level, so we ultimately went with the community level, although in some of those, in the LSL program, for example, we are able to do something a little more granular there. The metrics that we were looking at, after we looked, first off, just like familiarizing ourselves with all the different metrics that are out there or could be used. So it was kind of just like a learning process for us to begin with. And we considered a lot of them and looked at other states. And so really analyzing all the different metrics and getting familiar with them was quite the process. We ultimately felt like it would be best to include the most important metrics without adding so many to this definition that the data is redundant. Something could end up being just different angles to look at a similar topic in a community, for example. And along with that, we considered a lot like sampling error for small communities. Of course, we need to choose a metric that works for the whole state. And some metrics, although we think there would be value to them, there just isn't really reliable data at a small scale. For thresholds, I think this is probably, from my perspective, one of the single hardest policy decisions, knowing that that data is going to change from year to year and what that will look like on the ground. And so the thresholds are really kind of where we're setting the boundaries and cutoffs for each metric. That emphasis is a little less for our state because we do have a scaled approach. So, it's not either in or out, it's if they don't fit into one bucket, they'll fall into another one. Data sources, we wanted to choose data sources that would be reliable, could provide quality data for small communities, would be updated regularly and cover the whole state. So for us, that looks like a lot of Census Bureau. We do have some state data for population, but the vast majority of our data comes from the Census Bureau or the American Community Survey. And then because we have multiple metrics and you're in some ways comparing, socioeconomic data to population data, those are not a one-to-one, so we needed to consider the weight of each metrics in our system and how many points they would receive. In our system, not all metrics are weighted equally, and that's largely given because we thought some metrics were more important to the system or provided more reliable data than some of the other metrics. And complexity, our definition, in my opinion, may verge on being overly complex, but we did approach it with the intention that we wanted our customers and the public to be able to determine where they might fall on the DAC definition without needing help from our staff. Prior to revisiting this, we were getting a lot of calls about that, like, can you run the numbers for us? And so although now we do provide data for the whole state on scoring, it essentially provides a score for everyone. But even before then, the transparency was helpful and reduced the amount of calls we saw pretty quickly, even though we made the system more complex. For modeling, really each time we looked at a new metric, a new proposal, we ran the numbers to see how that would play out with real data. And I think that was probably one of the most important things we did throughout the process. It really helped us key in on the tiers that we would use. Our tiers are not equally spaced because it would not work that way either. The communities in the state don't all fall evenly within an equal point division in the tiers. So we really had to kind of adjust the tiers to what we thought meant a more equal distribution of communities throughout the state. And then impact, it's not lost on us that these decisions make a difference on the ground. Costly infrastructure projects result in rate hikes. And so to what extent PF can be used to mitigate those impacts, we'd love to see that. And, as I mentioned earlier, pretty early on, we recognized that we preferred a system that recognized a gradient of burdens a community faces rather than just an all or nothing approach, which in our view puts too much emphasis on a cutoff point. And I think I'll leave it there for now and save the rest for Q&A.
Thank you, Casey. Mark, you're next.
Thank you. I'll try and run through these pretty quick. I have a couple of them, but go to the next slide. Thanks. I'm going to give a kind of a quick overview of the process we did, but along the way, it'll touch on what we use for our definition. We'd been locked in state legislation for, 15 years. So around 2018, we started working with our state legislature to try and update our basically how we implement the Fed program so that we could have the ability to change scoring, not just for a DAC definition, but also for the regular one. And the way that worked was we started in 2018 and it got signed in 2022. So it's definitely a process. So if people are still starting or wanting to work, I kind of put what we had to do. And the really important things were figure out what you can and can't do with your state laws. The big one too was how your utilities are set up. In our state, they're set up, they make their rules, they set their rates, they decide who they serve and who they don't. So all the intermunicipal service agreements there, the state doesn't have any ability to tell them what to charge people. So in our state, we use what they are using. So if it's a big municipal system and they charge everyone equally, we use that whole area. If it's one community within that system coming in for just their collection system, that's what we look at versus the whole utility. So we basically had to tailor something that works based on how individual systems charge their customers. The big resources that were super helpful in 2022 when we were putting this first rewrite, so the first time we got to change our DAC definition was the state demographer. She was hugely helpful in helping us figure out which criteria were a little more robust or which ones were more even across the state or which ones were represented better. Also the treasurer and project managers. I'm not a project manager. I've always been on the financial end, so it was helpful to work with them. And also what we have now and we didn't then was GIS analysts, which were extremely helpful moving forward. That's to hire new staff if needed. We learned after our first rewrite in 2022 that we really could use some GIS and web help. And so we created a new position and they've been very, very helpful in helping us do a lot of these calculations and to try new criteria, new things to see how things were working. And then set priorities and then keep everyone in the loop. And that's been really easy too now with our upgraded web presence as far as just letting people know what we're doing and allowing things like public meetings and hearings to happen online and be recorded and viewed later. So if you can't make it, that's fine. It doesn't matter. You still have as much time to get to us and your voice and your questions are heard as much as everyone else's. Next slide, please. Here is the page we did. This is just a screenshot, but towards the bottom, you can kind of see how it goes pretty linear across the line. So we have our state revolving fund page. We have our affordability criteria page, which is where our current criteria is housed along with the form that you would apply for each year if you were applying for And here's where if I say overburdened and significantly overburdened, that means disadvantaged. When that legislation got rewritten, it was decided that overburdened and significantly overburdened would be used instead of disadvantaged. So they're interchangeable in a sense. And then this new affordability criteria page is what we made to show all the steps that we were going to be taking. Next slide, please. When I mentioned that the legislation being changed, so the legislation happened in 2022, and we had to really hustle to get it out before applications for FY23 because of all the new money. So with that, we at the time made our definition a little bit easier because we wanted to get as many people in as possible to get grant forgiveness dollars. We were also guessing, like Casey was explaining, there's a lot of different things that you do and you know and you don't know, and you try and guess what's going to work. So we tried to guess a little bit on the let more people inside when we developed them the first time, but we really had to rush just to get them through. So that's when we were using the demographer and other things. The thing too about learning about your state was we tried things that EPA was newly trying, like the lowest quintile and things like that. And we found that in Michigan, that didn't separate anybody. And we also looked at some other states' things. And when we tried to apply their data, it didn't separate people the way it did for other states, just because Michigan has a lot of small, a lot of medium, and a lot of very large systems. So everyone was all over the place, and we were trying to find a way to do that. Here, it's on the webpage, so we can kind of go on, but here's where we posted our timeline for what we were doing with our current ones, but try to explain the process, set a timeline, ask for input. We were collecting ideas throughout the last 3 years from people about what they liked about the new system and what they didn't. Then provide data to people and explain what you can or cannot do for legislation. There's a lot of things we'd like to do that we can't, and other things that we go the other way. Next slide, please. And this was the big thing for us. So what we landed on last time, we couldn't find like a lowest quintile or a poverty rate system that separated people the way, like in a clean way, so we could kind of capture who we wanted. So we decided to try a taxable value per capita as a new indicator. And we were trying that because it does house a lot of things, as in like housing prices, unemployment, poverty rate, all of that could be wrapped up in that number. We were also using the MAHI from the census data, which is an estimate, and we understand that it's an estimate, but the taxable value was a real number from Treasury that we could get every year. So we use a combination of the median annual household income, the taxable value per capita of the project area, or who's paying for the project area, and then also the local information on what they do. So for significantly overburdened, we understand and recognize that there are some communities that doesn't matter if their bill is small or large, they're going to have a problem paying for it for whatever. So for those two things, if you fall in the lowest 10% of the taxable value per capita for the state of Michigan, you automatically get assigned significantly overburdened, and you don't have to do anything else. You're automatically in. Also, if your median annual household income is below 125% for a family of 4 for this country, you are also automatically in. So to be significantly overburdened in Michigan, that's how you get in. And then you're assigned 25 out of 100 points for ranking. So you already have a quarter of the points being ranked on the list. For overburdened, it's a tiered approach. So if you don't qualify by that, you can automatically qualify by being the lowest 25% taxable value per capita. Or if you don't qualify that way, we have everybody figure out what a residential equivalency unit, so what a standard household pays per year, and if that number is higher than 1% of their system's median annual household income, that would be the other way you get in. So there's a multiple different ways you can get in, and then once you're in, you're assigned those 20 or 25 points, and then even furthermore after the fact, once the IUP is created, that's when they can assign additional principal forgiveness. And we also give tiered interest rates for overburdened and significantly overburdened communities, along with longer payback schedules as well, depending on the designation. The big thing here I wanted to show here, and this was the help with our GIS person, they created these survey 1, 2, 3 forms. So instead of having to fill out an Excel sheet of paper, an applicant goes online and they can now apply on just a 2-page thing. And when they apply, they're given a number. When they go to apply for overburdened or significantly overburdened status, they simply put that number in. It automatically fills out all their systems information and everything. And all they have to do is tell us where their project is, what the makeup of it is in the dollars, and it will immediately spit back to them an email saying in, out. It'll send us one. So immediately they'll know what our calculation was. If there was an issue, they can do it again. And then we can go back and forth from there. But it makes it, I mean, it's instant gratification for both them and us. Next slide, please. And then that's just our webpage. Everything from there, all the pages I mentioned are all right available on that main page with a little scroll down along with all the projects we've ever funded since '89 and some other stuff. So that's what I have.
Thank you both so much. Those real world examples, just there's nothing like it, right? And I saw that in the chat that Danielle pointed out that something that we hadn't necessarily talked about a lot is that where does the authority come from to make changes? And in the case of Michigan and Wisconsin, you have 2 different examples. One, the authority resides with the agency, and the other, the legislation, or excuse me, the legislature. We do have some questions from the audience. Case or Mark, I think you described, you already answered one that we received in advance, and that is, what are the current measurement tools being used to determine DACs in Michigan? We do have a question open for the group. How is MHI determined? What data source is it based on? What if the project impacts multiple towns and communities, like an example being a surface water treatment plant? What are the best practices for applying to the project service area, given that the data may be hard to find and develop? Any tips or tricks?
I can tell you what we do, and it's all in the back end, because when we came up with our metrics and criteria, we wanted the disadvantaged community to be able to apply themselves without having to hire an engineer or a consultant or whatever. So on some of those bigger systems, when they fill out that form for us, they tell us, because it's based on how they charge. Usually it's based on flow. So if one city has 80% of the flows and another municipality has 20, they tell us that. And then on the back end, we do all the math and blend together their taxable value number. We also blend together their MAHI number, and then we put it all together. And that's true with that, or we have community systems up to 125 communities, and it will calculate all of that and spit back a number. So that's how we do it, and that's how it blends it out on who's actually paying for the project.
And I think both of you mentioned that average MHI are using census or American Community Survey data. Casey, do you have any best practices for applying project service area?
Yeah. I don't know about best practice. I'm not 100% sure, actually. I believe ours is actually a blending based on population. So we do a similar thing to Eagle, but just using population and creating a percentage based on that. I know that's done for sanitary districts on the clean water side who don't have very clear delineations on a lot of their data. The ACS for us in that case isn't as helpful, so we need to do a lot of work on the back end to make that work for sanitary districts.
Okay, thank you. Another question and comment. So from Joseph Bueller, that oftentimes the subsidies provided to the water utility company as a whole. And so this is that matter of, the difference in DAC definitions for lead service lines versus an improvement that would be benefiting the whole service area. For a larger system, this may not find its way, for instance, as savings in a disadvantaged customer's wallet. What are some recommendations on how to better funnel savings from the drinking water SRF directly to customers in the disadvantaged community? And I'm wondering if this may be a rate making question.
I can try to give this a go.
Okay.
I don't know if this answers it directly, but one of the things we thought about a lot in making these definitions is economies of scale and things that can be addressed for our smaller communities. And the one of the challenges that we face with a principal forgiveness and policy is we are making an agreement with a community, which includes potentially even industry. And so how those, ultimately we would love to see rates stay low for individual ratepayers, but that is it's not always a one-to-one for us in a lot of our agreements, I would say.
You don't have any terms or conditions that require something at rate time, for example?
Right, like certain savings to be passed on. I mean, the maybe difference is with lead service line replacements, we do more intentionally target that a lot of the principal forgiveness is going to private lead service line replacements, and that way, because we don't have 100% principal forgiveness for our LSL program, we have to be intentional about how that is being used. So in that way, we are restricting that to private lead service line replacements to what extent we can.
We're in a similar boat because we can't tell people how to charge. They just have to meet certain environmental goals, but they can charge whatever. So theoretically, if they got a SRF loan from us, consumers' rates might not change at all. You assume they will, but you can't force it. And that's also why we try and when we ask for what a residential equivalency unit is, we have them dumb everything down to that. So then it's apples to apples across the state, because say a vacation community could have 80% of their costs loaded onto a fixed cost because half the residents are gone and they want to make it fair for all the other ones. Whereas a community where everyone waters their grass might make it all 80% towards how much water they use. So what we do is we have them take their total annual flows and then divide it out by the average household size, or then we have an AW to WA conversion factor if they want to do it by meters, set everything at like a 3/4 meter and then go a 2-inch meter is about 8 of those. So basically we bring everyone to the same financial thing. So when we say how much is it costing per the mahi, everyone's being looked at on the same thing. It's not like they can tweak their bills to make it look like they're more expensive or not. And then industry, government, everything is also factored in.
Right. Thank you for that. I was hoping we could get into some rate making, Mark. I knew you were just the person. We have one other question. How do you handle determinations that a system is meeting their TMF capacity requirements to obtain funding if they're charging $20 a month for an $80 a month system?
I will say that that's not me that would be determining that. We have when our engineering staff is looking at that, they have benchmarks they have to hit, and that used to be handled by me and a partner of mine in-house when we would do rate reviews and people would come in for a project. Now our treasury department handles it specifically because they ended up looking at it afterwards anyway. So our treasury department, before they tender a loan, will look and see that the community is charging enough to both pay their rates for their constant costs, and then they're also able to afford the loan going forward. So that's how it gets checked.
Yeah, I mean, we do a financial capability review for the loan to make sure that they have sufficient revenues to pay for the loan, and they'll meet those tests, which, and I think in our cases tend to be fairly stringent. So that is usually the test that we're focusing on. Do they have sufficient financial capability to repay the loan?
Right.
I'll say in general, the SRF does not have really clawback measures for pretty much anything. So it's kind of tough, and you want to get it as right the first time as you can, because that's kind of your opportunity.
Yeah. Right. Well, thank you. And then thank you for that note, Chris. It's an important note that when you look at revenues, you have to look at paying for the O&M on the project as well. And so I know that some states and some folks that look at rates will look at some kind of multiplier to make it an easy calculation, and make sure that they have that to cover and that's incorporated too. But that's an important note. We're coming up towards the top of the hour. And since we have kind of a mixed group attending here today, I wanted to ask one question of both Mark and Casey, and that is, what have you seen the role of stakeholders, advocates, utilities, et cetera, in this process of arriving at DAC definitions?
Well, I can jump in because we are currently revising ours, so that that legislation passed in 22 said we could look at definitions no earlier than every 3 years. So we are currently at every 3 years. Looking at it now, it looks like maybe every 4 years might be better just because of the funding cycle. We really only have data for 2 years when we want to look back at 3. And then it's kind of overly weighted towards the last couple of years where there's money that will never be there again. So you're kind of guessing off imaginary numbers, which makes things very difficult. But I think ultimately it depends on the state. Like, we love hearing from everyone and like hearing all the ideas, but like if a resident has a problem with their bill, they need to talk to their utility because we can't control that. So ultimately, like, the people that would be impacted most by our overburdened DAC definition would be the utilities themselves. Like, this is working or this isn't. But we've been taking comments from anyone who's wanted, and so we've kept it open for the last kind of 9 months and had a 3-month comment period getting it. I will say that also maybe a learned experience is a really long comment period doesn't mean it's better, because we still got 80% of our comments in the last week. Regardless of whether you're trying to do it, that might have backfired a little for us because we were hoping to have more time to work with stuff, but it's still kind of dialed down. But that's how it's kind of worked for us. But it really depends on, kind of like in the law terms, who has standing, like who's most affected by this. And in our state, that's who's running the public utilities who are applying to the SRF. And customers of them should be going to them if they have a problem with their bill. And one of the solutions that those utilities have would be to come and use our program.
Yeah, and I'll just add that for us, we also welcome comments from a broad group, and that primarily comes through the intended use plan public comment process. And when we were revisiting these, we actually did change some pieces of our DAC definition in response to some of the public comments. So that was a learning process for us. We always expect to learn from outside entities as well. But I would maybe just add that I think, as we've talked about, because this is a complex process that requires careful deliberation, I think in some ways the intended use plan process is not always the best. We'll certainly hear it out, but I think oftentimes we have to say, that's an interesting idea. Maybe we need to consider that for the next round of intended use plan revisions. So, and I'm sure that can be a little frustrating, but just in the time frame that we have to address the public comments and post the final IUP, usually we're not able to look at that in as much depth as we would like. So I think even engaging with the SRFs outside of that IUP public comment process, from my perspective, might be more fruitful for both sides.
Thank you both. Those are some great closing comments to round us out here. I think, Valerie, we can close out the webinar here with a reminder of what's next. As a reminder, this is webinar number 2 in a series. We have a September 1 coming up next Thursday on policy decisions that talk about how principal forgiveness is distributed to SRF applicants, some of the trade-offs there with some of the things we've talked about today and other ranking considerations. There is a recording available if you missed last week's webinar on the interest rates and principal forgiveness considerations. And then today, of course, with the DAC definitions. So there will be a follow-up email tomorrow with links to the recording and resources. Thank you all for joining us today. Really appreciate all the questions and the robust conversation. Let's keep it going. And please do feel free to reach out to our team with any ideas for areas for deeper research and continued conversation. Take care.